Welcome back to Revenge Codex. My name is Grace Taylor. I'm 27 years old. And the night my husband called me replaceable, I was sitting at a dinner table, surrounded by his entire family, holding a glass of sparkling water, wearing the dress he once said made me look like I actually belonged somewhere. I remember the exact sound of the word. Not loud. Not angry. Casual. The way you'd say pass the salt or check the weather. He said it between bites of his mother's roast chicken, with a half smile on his face like he was making an observation about the weather, and not dismantling 3 years of my life in front of 8 people. Grace is replaceable, he said. Every woman thinks she's irreplaceable. That's the funniest part, his brother laughed. A short, sharp sound, like a seal. His sister looked at her plate. His mother refilled her wine glass without meeting my eyes. And the table moved on, conversation drifting to something about a football game, someone's promotion, the price of gas. I sat there, perfectly still. I didn't cry. I didn't stand up. I didn't throw my water glass or make a scene or leave early. I just sat there, in that yellow dress, and I felt something settle inside me like concrete hardening. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly understood in that moment, was that I had already been preparing for exactly this. For months. And 3 weeks later, Daniel was calling me 11 times in one afternoon. I didn't pick up once. Before I tell you the rest, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually think about it. Have you ever been in a room where someone reduced you to nothing, and the worst part wasn't what they said? It was that everyone around them just let it happen. Where the silence of the people you trusted felt louder than the cruelty itself. If you know that feeling, stay with me. Because this story is for you. And if you're watching this from somewhere far away, London, Lagos, Manila, wherever you are at this hour, I want you to know that what I'm about to tell you took everything I had. But it gave me everything back. Let me tell you who people thought I was. They thought I was the girl who got lucky. That was the narrative. Grace Taylor, ordinary girl from a modest family in a mid-sized city, somehow ended up with Daniel Mercer, whose family had old money, a real estate portfolio, and a last name that opened doors in our town the way a key opens a lock. Smoother. Effortless. Automatic. People saw me and they saw a woman who had been upgraded. Plucked from mediocrity. Given access to a life she hadn't earned. His friends said it without saying it, in the way they'd turn slightly away from me at parties. In the way his mother would ask me questions like, "And what did you study?" Again, with a patience so deliberate it was its own kind of contempt. In the way Daniel himself would sometimes introduce me at events as my wife, and then immediately pivot to something else, as if further description wasn't warranted. That was what they believed. Here is what was true. I had a master's degree in financial analytics from a program that accepted 11 students per year. I had spent 4 years before meeting Daniel building an independent consulting practice, quiet work, technical work, the kind of work that involves spreadsheets at midnight and conference calls at 7 in the morning, and a kind of sustained mental focus that most people find genuinely exhausting. I had 3 long-term clients who paid me more per month than Daniel's younger brother made in a quarter. I had savings. I had investments. I had a plan. I had deliberately kept all of this quiet. Not because I was ashamed. Not because I was hiding. Because early in my relationship with Daniel, I had noticed something. When I talked about my work, his attention shifted. Not dramatically, just slightly. A micro-withdrawal, like a plant turning away from a light source that was too intense. He was more comfortable when I was supportive. When I was soft around the edges. When I asked questions about his deals rather than describing my own. I told myself it was a small thing. I told myself I was being flexible. Accommodating. That strong women sometimes knew when to hold themselves back for the sake of something larger. I was wrong about what I was doing. But I wouldn't understand that for a long time. We met at a fundraising event 3 years before that dinner. Daniel was charming in the way that certain men are charming, with complete confidence in the effect he was having, which somehow makes their effect more powerful rather than less. He laughed easily. He had good posture. He remembered names. He asked follow-up questions and made you feel, for those 30 seconds of his attention, like you were the most interesting person in the room. I was not naive. I had met men like Daniel before. But there was something in him that felt real beneath the performance, a dry humor, a self-deprecation that surfaced occasionally in private, a vulnerability he showed in small, rationed doses that made you feel chosen when you received one. We dated for 1.5 years. We were engaged for 8 months. And in all of that time, I can look back now and see the pattern clearly, the way you can see a stain on fabric once the light hits it at the right angle. The first moment that mattered, and I didn't recognize it then, but I do now, was 6 months into dating. I had just signed a significant new client, the largest contract I'd had at that point. I was genuinely excited. I called Daniel from the parking lot of my office, still buzzing with the kind of energy that comes from building something real. He listened. He said, "That's great, babe," and then he told me about a deal his father had closed that day, and we spent the next 20 minutes talking about that instead. That sentence mattered. "That's great, babe," 4 words. Said the way you'd acknowledge someone sneezing. And then, onward, to something more important. I filed it away somewhere I didn't consciously name. The second moment was at a dinner party, 8 months in, hosted by one of Daniel's college friends. There were 6 of us at the table. Someone asked what everyone did for work. Going around the tables: lawyer, architect, marketing director, finance guy, Daniel, and then me. When it came to me, I started to explain my consulting work, the actual work, the analytics, the clients, and Daniel said, gently, easily, like he was doing me a favor, "Grace does some freelance stuff. Financial stuff. She's really the heart of our household though." He smiled at me when he said it. Everyone nodded pleasantly and moved on. And I sat there. And I smiled back. And I thought, he's proud of us as a unit. He didn't mean it dismissively. He's just simplifying for the room. I was wrong. But it would take me much longer to understand what I was actually watching. We got married in September. Small ceremony, which I preferred, though Daniel's family had lobbied for something larger. His mother, Patricia, had strong opinions about most things, and she had particularly strong opinions about what the Mercer family wedding should look like. She wanted a venue that would photograph well. She wanted a guest list that included people whose names meant something in the city. She wanted, I think, a bride who would be a worthy backdrop, beautiful enough, gracious enough, quiet enough for the main event, which was the Mercer family itself. I wore ivories. I carried white ranunculus. Daniel cried when he saw me come down the aisle, which I held onto for a long time afterward as evidence of something essential and true in him. The first weeks of marriage were fine. Better than fine, actually. There's a specific intimacy to early marriage that I had not expected, the way a shared life folds together, routines clicking into place, a new kind of privacy created between 2 people. I liked it. I was happy. But there are always small things, and I was starting to be less willing to file them away. 2 months in, Daniel's firm was hosting a client dinner. I attended as his wife. One of the senior partners asked me what I did. Before I could answer, Daniel said, "She manages the home front." "You know how it is," the partner nodded. I said nothing. 3 months in, I mentioned to Daniel that I was thinking about pitching a particular corporate client, a significant expansion for my practice. He listened and then said, slowly, carefully, "Do you really have capacity for that right now? With everything we're building here, what we were building there was a marriage. Not a construction project requiring all available labor." But I softened my pitch. I held back. I told myself I was being balanced. 4 months in, we were at his mother's house for Sunday lunch, a weekly ritual that I had learned to treat as mandatory, regardless of what else I had scheduled. Patricia asked me, with perfect pleasantness, whether I'd thought about taking on a bit less of the consulting work now that I was settled. "You've got a full life now," she said, looking around her kitchen like the fullness of my life was obvious from the cabinetry and the good china. "Some women find it's a relief." I looked at her and I said, very politely, "I love my work." She smiled and said, "Of course you do," in a tone that translated directly to, "For now." That sentence mattered. For now. 5 months into the marriage, Daniel and I had our first real argument. Not a disagreement, an argument. Raised voices. A door that didn't slam but got closed with a firmness that said everything a slam would have. It started, as these things often do, with something surface level. He had made plans for us on a Saturday without asking me, plans I had to cancel because I had a client call already scheduled. He was frustrated. He said I was always working. I said I had told him about the call. He said I was being defensive. I said he hadn't checked with me. Back and forth, tightening. And then he said something that I heard clearly and marked, and did not react to in that moment. He said, "A wife shouldn't have to be scheduled like a business meeting." I looked at him. He was not being cruel. Exactly. He genuinely believed this. He had grown up watching his mother arrange herself entirely around his father's life, her social calendar built around his commitments, her sense of herself dependent on her function within their household. He had absorbed this as the natural order of things. He thought he was describing a loving marriage. He thought he was telling me what a wife should want. I said, very calmly, "I hear you," and I went to bed. And I lay there in the dark and I thought about everything. Not in a panicked way. Not in a grieving way. With a kind of cold clarity that was new, like I'd turned on a fluorescent light in a room I'd been navigating by candlelight. I thought, he does not see me. He sees a function I'm meant to perform. I thought, his family doesn't see me either. They see an accessory that should eventually learn to stay quiet. I thought, and I have been letting this happen. I have been making myself smaller and quieter and softer, thinking it was a form of love, when it was actually a form of disappearing. I stopped reacting that night. And I started observing. From that night forward, I paid a different kind of attention. I noticed how often Daniel spoke over me at shared dinners. Not aggressively, smoothly, the way someone changes lanes on a highway without signaling because they've never had to check their mirrors. I counted. Once. Dinner conversation. 2 other couples. 2 hours. He redirected, interrupted, or completed my sentences 11 times. He was never rude about it. He was warm. Actually. Inclusive. The table liked him enormously. I noticed how my name functioned in his family's conversations. Daniel's wife when I wasn't present. Grace when I was, but with a particular inflection that kept me on the visitor side of belonging. His sister, Meredith, was cordial in the way that some people are cordial, with a warmth that has a ceiling, that lets you know exactly how far in you're permitted to come. I noticed how Daniel talked about money. Our money. Technically, we had a joint account into which we both contributed, but in the way he talked about it. What to spend. When. On what. The decisions always moved through him. He wasn't controlling in a way that was obvious. He just had stronger opinions, stated more confidently, and I had been agreeing because I had decided, somewhere in those early months, that choosing my battles meant letting most things go. I was not choosing my battles. I was forfeiting them. I noticed these things and I did not react. I started keeping notes, not dramatic diary entries, but clean observations. Dated. Specific. The kind of record you keep when you understand that clarity will matter later. And I kept working. Quietly. Steadily. Without making it a point of contention. My practice was growing. I had taken on 2 new clients in the months since Daniel suggested I might want to scale back. I had begun positioning myself for something larger, a possibility I had been circling for a while but hadn't committed to yet. A formal partnership offer with a financial services firm that had been watching my work for over a year. Nobody in Daniel's world knew about this. Not because I was deceiving them. Because they had never asked. That wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was a Tuesday night, 6 weeks before the dinner. Daniel had been out with colleagues. He came home at 11, not drunk but loosened, in the particular expansive mood that alcohol sometimes produces in people who are already comfortable with themselves. He sat on the edge of the bed while I was reading and he said, with a careless kind of affection, "You know what I love about you, Grace. You're uncomplicated." I looked at him. He smiled. "I mean it as a compliment. Some guys have wives who are constantly, demanding. Complicated. Always needing something. You're just easy. You work your little jobs. You keep things running. You don't make everything into a whole thing." He said this with love on his face. He reached over and pushed a strand of hair away from my cheek. I said, "That's sweet." He fell asleep in 4 minutes. I sat in the lamplight and I thought, your little jobs. And something inside me, something that had been cracking quietly for months, went fully, finally, clean through. I didn't cry. I've told you. I don't do that anymore. Not about this. I thought about the partnership offer. I thought about the conversations I had been having, carefully and privately, over the past several weeks. I thought about the decision I had been delaying. I thought about the fact that I had been delaying it, at least in part, because I had been unconsciously waiting for some sign from Daniel, some recognition, some moment where he saw me clearly, and it became possible to share the truth of what I was building. That night, in the lamplight, with my husband sleeping 4 feet away from me, I stopped waiting. I accepted the offer. Electronically, quietly, from my phone. And then I put the phone face down on the nightstand, and I looked at the ceiling and I thought, now we wait. The dinner was 3 weeks later. Patricia hosted monthly family dinners, a tradition I had initially found charming and had come to understand as a form of centralized information management. Around that table, the family aligned. Narratives were confirmed. Positions were established. It was elegant. Actually, if you paid attention. Patricia ran that table the way a conductor runs an orchestra, without appearing to do anything. There were 8 of us that night. Daniel and me. His parents, Robert and Patricia. His brother, James. And James's girlfriend, Kelsey. His sister Meredith and her husband, Todd. The food was good. The wine was better. Robert was talking about a commercial property deal he was considering. James had a new car. Meredith was describing a trip she and Todd were planning. I was present, attentive, asking appropriate questions, being, and I recognize this now with a kind of distant humor, uncomplicated. And then James said something about a woman from his office. An ambitious woman, apparently. Someone who thought too highly of herself. The phrase he used was that she'd gotten ideas, and Daniel laughed. In that easy, reflexive way he had. and said, "Women do that. They start thinking they're irreplaceable. Every woman thinks she's irreplaceable." He looked at me when he said it. Not meanly. Almost fondly. Like I was included in his anthropological observation. "Grace is replaceable," he said. "Every woman thinks she's irreplaceable." "That's the funniest part," James laughed. Kelsey looked at her fork. Meredith looked at her plate. Robert looked at Daniel with something that might have been mild pride. Patricia refilled her wine. And I sat very still, in the yellow dress, and I felt the concrete finish hardening. I smiled. I took a sip of water. I said nothing. The table moved on. Afterward, driving home, Daniel was in a good mood. He talked about the property deal Robert had mentioned. He was already thinking about how the family might benefit from it. He reached over and put a hand on my knee at a red light, which he did when he was feeling warm and connected, and I thought about the fact that he had completely forgotten what he said at the table. Not suppressed it. Not regretted it and moved on. Forgotten it. It had cost him nothing. That was the part that mattered. Remember that. At home, I changed out of the yellow dress and I hung it carefully and I thought, I'm not going to need this anymore. I don't mean the dress. I mean the version of myself I'd been wearing. What followed was 3 weeks. 3 weeks that nobody around me could read. Because on the surface, nothing changed. I was still at Sunday lunches. I was still agreeable at dinners. I was still the wife Daniel had described to his family. Uncomplicated, manageable, decorative in just the right ways. But underneath that, things were moving. The partnership I had accepted was not a small arrangement. The firm Callaway and Hess Financial Group was a significant regional player. The partnership offer had come with an equity stake, a 6-figure base, and a title, Senior Consulting Partner. The announcement of my joining was being planned by their communications team. A press release. Industry publications. Their client newsletter. I had asked them to hold the announcement for 3 weeks, while I arranged something personal. I spent those 3 weeks being meticulous. I spoke to an attorney, a woman named Sandra who I had met through a professional network years earlier and who I trusted completely. I told Sandra what I was thinking. She listened, asked precise questions, and gave me precise guidance. I was not doing anything aggressive or retaliatory. I was doing what any financially literate person in an unequal partnership should do, understanding my position clearly before significant change occurred. I documented my independent financial history. 4 years of business records. Client contracts with confidentiality protections intact. Tax filings. Investment accounts. The paper trail of a person who had, quietly and steadily, been building something real. I informed 2 of my oldest clients, women who had worked with me since the early days of my practice, about the transition. Both of them responded with immediate enthusiasm. One of them sent me a bottle of champagne. The other sent a message that I still have. They finally get to have you properly. Lucky them, I told no one in Daniel's world. Not because I was afraid. Because I had learned something in those months of observation. Information is power only when it's controlled. The moment you share something prematurely, you lose the ability to decide when and how it lands. I was going to decide when and how it landed. On a Thursday morning, the Callaway and Hess communications team released the announcement. They had excellent distribution. Industry newsletters. LinkedIn. 2 regional business publications. Their own network, which was substantial. By 10 in the morning, my phone had 47 notifications. I silenced it. I made coffee. I sat at the kitchen table in my apartment. I had moved back to my own place 6 days earlier. Quietly. While Daniel was at a conference, leaving a letter that was calm and clear and gave nothing away about what was coming. and I drank my coffee and I looked out the window at the Thursday morning. I thought about the dinner table. The yellow dress. That's the funniest part. I thought about 4 years of building something real while everyone around me saw a girl who had gotten lucky. I thought about the Tuesday night and the lamplight and your little jobs. I finished my coffee. My phone showed 11 missed calls from Daniel between 10 and 2 o'clock. He had seen it. Let me tell you how I know the rest of what happened, because I wasn't there for all of it. Meredith called me at 2:15. I picked up that call, because I had decided to pick up Meredith's call specifically. She was the one who had looked at her plate during the dinner. She was the one who, over the months of my marriage, had occasionally let something slip through her composure, a look, a hesitation, a moment that suggested she was more aware than she performed being. She said, "Grace," I said. "Hi." Meredith, there was a pause. A long one. I let it breathe. She said, "Callaway and Hess," "Yes," I said. Another pause. "Senior consulting partner," "That's right." I could hear her breathing. I could hear the specific quality of a person recalibrating in real time, going back through everything they thought they knew and re-examining it with different information. She said, slowly, "How long have you been building this?" I said. "A while," she said. "Does Daniel?" And then she stopped, because she already knew the answer. I said, "He called me replaceable." Meredith, the silence after that sentence was one of the most complete silences I have ever heard. Not uncomfortable. Not hostile. Just full. Like a room after music stops. She said, very quietly, "I know," and then, "I'm sorry." She was the only one who said that. I want to note that clearly. In all of the communications that came in the days that followed, and there were many, she was the only one who said sorry. I said, "Thank you," and that was all we needed. Daniel's messages started as confused. 11 calls. Then a voicemail I listened to once and deleted. Then a series of texts that tracked his emotional progression with something like clinical precision. The first wave. Disbelief. "Can you call me? I think I'm seeing something about you at Callaway and Hess." Is this right? The question marks of a man who doesn't yet have a framework for what he's looking at. The second wave. Recalibration. Okay, so this is real. Can we talk? I didn't know about this. Why didn't you tell me? The pivot from confusion to an attempt to reframe. The why didn't you tell me is interesting. It tries to make my information management the issue, rather than the circumstances that made information management necessary. The third wave. Something that looked like emotion, but moved the way anxiety does when it's dressed up as feeling. "Grace. I love you. Please call me. We should talk about this." I don't understand what's happening, the word love appearing now, doing the work it's asked to do in these situations, trying to return things to familiar territory. I read all of them. I responded to none of them that day. What happened next, and I know this because I heard it from 2 independent sources, was that Patricia called a family meeting. Not formally. But Patricia had a way of convening people. By Thursday evening, Meredith and James were both at their parents' house. Robert was present. Patricia, I imagined, sat at the head of her kitchen table with the same composure she brought to everything, and they discussed the situation. Here is what they were discussing. The fact that the woman they had categorized as decorative, as manageable, as lucky, as replaceable, had been sitting quietly among them for months with a professional identity and financial position that none of them had thought to look for, because they had already decided who she was. I would have liked to be in that room. Not to witness their discomfort, that was never the point. But to see the specific moment when a story that a family has been telling itself has to be revised. That moment has a texture I find compelling. Patricia called me on Friday morning. I had decided, deliberately, which calls to take. Meredith. Yes. Patricia. Yes. But the second day. Not the first. Daniel. Not yet. She called at 9. I waited until 9:15, then picked up. She said, "Grace. How are you?" The composure in her voice was extraordinary. I genuinely admired it. Another woman might have led with apology or explanation, or an attempt to establish closeness. Patricia did not. She maintained form. She asked how I was as though we were beginning routine check-inches. I said, "I'm well." Patricia. "Thank you for calling," she said. "I imagine it's been a busy few days." "It has," I said. "The announcement went well." There was a small pause. "I didn't know," she said. And for Patricia, that sentence was enormous. It was as much vulnerability as she allowed herself. "No," I said. "Most people didn't," she said. "Daniel didn't know." Another pause. Then, carefully, "He'd like to speak with you." "I know," I said. "I've seen his messages." She waited. She was too controlled to push. I said, "I need some time." "Patricia," she said. "Of course, a beat." And then something I had never heard from her before, something small and cracked. "You're good at what you do." It wasn't an apology. It was the closest she knew how to come to one. I received it for what it was. "Thank you," I said. "That means something, and I meant it. Not because I needed her validation, but because I understood what it cost her. I want to tell you about Sunday. 6 days after the announcement. I had agreed, through a carefully worded text, through Sandra's guidance on how to frame these things, to meet Daniel at the house we had shared. Neutral logistics. I would be there in the afternoon. He would be there. We would talk. I dressed carefully. Not for him. For myself. There's a difference. And it matters. I wore grey. Clean lines. Hair back. I walked into that house where I had made myself smaller and softer and quieter for 9 months, and I felt very calm. Daniel was standing in the kitchen when I came inches. He looked like a man who had not slept well. The careless ease that was his natural register had been replaced by something unsteady, and I recognized that he was seeing me differently in that moment, seeing me the way you see a room differently after you've discovered there's a door in it you'd never noticed. He said, "Grace," I said. "Hi." "Daniel." He moved toward me and I sat down at the kitchen table, which created a natural structure, sitting, composed, clear, and he sat across from me, and for a moment neither of us said anything. He said, "I didn't know." "I know you didn't," I said. "Why didn't you tell me?" I looked at him. Calmly. Without anger. Without heat. "Because," I said, "when I talked about my work, you weren't interested. And when I did tell you things, they got smaller in your hands. You turned my biggest contract into some freelance stuff, you called my work your little jobs, and then you called me replaceable at your mother's table in front of your entire family, and you forgot you'd done it before we got back to the car." He opened his mouth. He closed it. "I'm not angry," I said. And that was true. "But I need you to understand that I've been here the whole time. You just decided who I was before you looked." He was quiet for a long time. The good quality of man in Daniel, the part that had made me believe in him, was present in that silence. He was actually listening. He was actually taking it inches. He was not defending or deflecting or reframing. He said, "Finally. I think I thought," and he stopped. Started again. "My father always, the way things worked in our family." "I know," I said. I watched it. He looked at the table. He was not the villain of a story. He was something more complicated, and in some ways more sad. A man who had absorbed a set of beliefs so completely that they felt like reality, who had organized his marriage around them without ever examining them, and who was only now, at great cost, being asked to see what that had built. He said, "Is there anything, can we?" "I don't know," I said. And that was also true. I need time. I need space. I need you to actually reckon with what I've told you, not just with what it means for us practically. He nodded. I stood up. I had said what I came to say. I had said it without fury, without performance, without any of the chaos that would have made this about emotion rather than truth. I walked to the door. I put my hand on the frame and I turned back. Not for drama, just because there was one more thing. Daniel, I said. He looked up. I was never lucky to have you. We were equal. I just let you forget that. I walked out into the Sunday afternoon. There is a specific feeling that comes after a long, quiet effort finally becomes visible. It is not triumphant in the way I expected. It is not loud. It is more like the feeling of putting down something heavy you've carried so long you stopped noticing the weight, and then standing straight, and feeling the length of your own spine, and breathing fully for the first time. That is what those weeks felt like. And in the months that followed, the partnership at Callaway and Hess was extraordinary. The work was substantial, genuinely challenging, the kind that requires everything you have and gives back more. My colleagues there saw me with complete clarity from day one, not because I had to prove anything, but because the context was honest from the start. I was not someone's wife. I was not a background figure. I was a senior partner, introduced as such, treated as such, asked for my opinion and given credit for it. I learned, in that environment, what it felt like to be fully visible. It felt like coming home to a room I'd never been in but recognized immediately. Daniel and I did not reconcile quickly or easily. I will not pretend otherwise. There were more conversations. There were difficult ones. He did the work he said he would do, not perfectly, not without setback, but genuinely. He talked to someone. He examined things about himself that were not comfortable to examine. He called me, one evening about 2 months later, and said something that surprised me in its precision. I think I was afraid of you. I think I made you smaller because something in me knew that if I really saw you, I'd have to look at myself. That sentence mattered. I did not rush back. I did not perform forgiveness before I felt it. I took every bit of time I needed, and I refused to feel guilty for that. And I did not. What I will tell you is this. The version of Grace Taylor who sat at that dinner table in the yellow dress, holding her water glass, letting the word replaceable land and settle without reaction, that woman knew something that the people at the table did not. She knew she had already made her moves. She knew the board looked completely different than anyone in that room understood. She knew that the most powerful thing she could do in that moment was nothing. Not silence out of fear. Not silence out of weakness. Silence as strategy. Silence as precision. The silence of someone who understands that you don't respond to someone who has underestimated you. You simply continue building. And then one day, they call. And you decide whether to pick up. I want to leave you with something that took me a long time to understand, and that I now carry with me as clearly as my own name. Being underestimated is only a wound if you accept the estimate. If you refuse to accept it, if you go home and keep building, keep working, keep accumulating evidence of your own reality, the underestimation doesn't diminish you. It just delays the moment when others catch up to what you already know. And that delay, that gap between what they believe and what's actually true, that is not your disadvantage. That is your leverage. My name is Grace Taylor. I'm 27 years old. I'm a senior consulting partner at one of the most respected financial services firms in my region. I have a practice built on 4 years of serious work that nobody in the room bothered to ask about. I have a mind that my colleagues describe as precise, and clients who have followed me through every transition because they know what I can do. And once, at a dinner table, my husband called me replaceable. He was wrong about a lot of things, but he was most wrong about that.